Two men, same organization, same week. The first receives an email on a Tuesday afternoon, a senior principal, someone 3 levels above him asking if he has 30 minutes to walk through a decision before it goes to the leadership team. He does. They meet. At no point during that conversation does the principal explain why he called this particular person. He simply did. The conversation is frank in a way that formal meetings never are. Assumptions are named that would never survive the light of an official session. The actual shape of the problem, not the version the committee will see, but the version that actually exists, is examined directly without the performance that formal settings require from everyone inside them. By Friday, the decision has been made. The announcement goes out.
The first man's name is not on it anywhere, but everyone who was in the room knows whose thinking shaped it. That knowledge travels quietly through the informal network. It adds another layer to a position that was already real before this week, and that will be more real next week, without any official process having acknowledged it. The second man finds out about the decision the same way everyone else does, through the announcement. His performance record is stronger. His tenure is longer. His formal contributions are more visible and more consistently recognized across every official measure the organization uses to evaluate people. He is, by every metric the system produces, the more successful of the two. He cannot explain what he is missing. More importantly, he cannot ask.
Because the question itself, why does he seem to hold less actual influence than his record should produce, cannot be raised in any formal setting without revealing something about him that would make the answer worse. The informal hierarchy cannot be appealed to in a formal process. That is not an accident. It is the defining feature of how it operates. What he is missing is not a tactic. It is not a relationship he forgot to cultivate or a skill he failed to develop. It is a map. Specifically, the map of the second system, the one running beneath every organization, every social environment, every professional hierarchy he has ever moved through. The system that actually routes authority, shapes decisions before they are formally made, and determines whose judgment matters. Before any meeting is called, any vote is taken, any announcement is drafted. He has been navigating by the official map his entire career. That map is real. It governs certain things. It simply does not govern the things he cares most about. Every institution presents itself as a single hierarchy. One structure, one logic. Formal authority flowing down from designated positions, formal recognition flowing up through designated processes, outcomes determined by the official criteria the institution has chosen to announce. Performance reviews, promotion committees, competency frameworks, stated values, an elaborate architecture of visible accountability that creates, in the men who move through it, a working model of how the system operates. This model is not wrong. The formal hierarchy exists and it functions. But it functions the way a public agenda functions at the beginning of a meeting, as the visible layer of a situation whose actual shape was determined by everything that happened before the session was called. Beneath every formal hierarchy, a second one operates. It has no chart. It appears in no policy document. It is never explained to anyone during onboarding, never referenced in any performance framework, never acknowledged in any official communication. It is the informal hierarchy, the accumulated web of trust, proximity, information access, and perceived judgment that constitutes how decisions actually move through a human system. It is not a distortion of the formal structure. It is not its shadow or its corruption. It is its substance. The formal hierarchy is the story the institution tells about itself. The informal hierarchy is the mechanism that actually holds it together. These two structures are not adversaries. The formal system needs the informal one to function at the speed and nuance that official processes cannot reach. but they operate on entirely different currencies. They reward entirely different behaviors. And the man who has spent years learning to navigate one of them, the visible one, the one with the published rules, will find consistently that the outcomes he cares most about are being determined by the other. The reason most men never see this clearly is not intelligence. It is not laziness or lack of ambition. It is structural blindness, the condition of holding a map that is accurate for what it shows and completely silent about what it omits. The man with structural blindness performs correctly within the visible system. He produces the outputs the formal hierarchy measures. He receives the recognition the formal hierarchy distributes. And he experiences, in return, a persistent, low-grade confusion that he usually interprets as unfairness, the gap between what he has deposited and what he has received. The men with less obvious capability, who somehow occupy positions of greater actual influence, the decisions made in rooms he was never told about, the names that appear on shortlists he didn't know existed. He cannot name what he is missing because the formal system, by design, never names it either. The informal hierarchy does not announce itself. It does not publish its membership criteria. It operates in the space between what institutions formally acknowledge and what they actually depend on, and that space is where the outcomes that matter most are decided. Machiavelli built his entire political project around one observation that the official theorists of his era consistently refused to make. Every political structure contains two architectures. The first is the state as it presents itself. The laws, the titles, the succession arrangements, the formal logic of who holds authority over whom and on what basis. The second is the state as it actually operates. The alliances, the obligations, the proximity to real power that has nothing to do with official position. The social intelligence of knowing which conversations to have before which decisions are made, and with whom, and in what sequence. The rulers who built durable authority understood both architectures with equal clarity. They navigated the second while publicly performing the first. And they never confused these two tasks, because confusing them, believing the official architecture was the real one, calibrating your behavior entirely to what the formal system rewarded, was the specific error that made a ruler manageable, predictable, a known quantity that the people around him could navigate with confidence, because they understood his model of the situation better than he understood theirs. Machiavelli's term for the capacity this requires is virtù, not virtue in the moral sense, but something more precise and more demanding, the ability to read the actual nature of a situation rather than its official presentation. The man of virtù walks into a room and perceives the informal geometry, who holds real weight in this specific context, what alliances are currently active, which tensions beneath the surface will determine how the visible conversation lands. He responds to the room as it is, not as the org chart or the meeting agenda says it should be. The ruler who lacked virtù was not necessarily incapable. His formal authority was real, but it was being administered inside a structure whose actual operating logic he could not read. The men around him who could read it moved with a freedom he could not account for, their actions always slightly better calibrated than their official position should have permitted, their influence always slightly larger than their formal authority could explain. He experienced them as fortunate, as politically skilled, as possessed of some quality he couldn't name. What they possessed was a map he didn't have. Robert Greene documented this same dynamic across a wider historical record and identified the specific mechanism Machiavelli had observed but not traced in full detail. In every court, creative hierarchy, military organization, and professional institution Greene studied across 5 centuries, the most influential figures were almost never the most formally decorated. They were the ones who had built something durable inside the informal structure. Information proximity to the people who made real decisions, narrative authority over how events were interpreted by the people who mattered, relational capital that no official process could assign because it accumulated only through the genuine quality of repeated direct engagement across levels and functions. And there was always, in Greene's account, a specific discipline that separated the men who held this position from the men who almost held it. They did not convert informal authority into formal claims before the informal authority was fully established. They allowed the informal to compound in the space where it operates with maximum freedom, before it becomes visible, before it becomes contestable, before it attracts the institutional review that formal authority always invites. The men who reached for the title, the announcement, the official recognition before the informal foundation was complete, found that the act of formalizing was also the act of diminishing. What had been unassailable became reviewable. What had moved freely became subject to procedure. That is the mechanism the formal system never teaches, because the formal system has no language for it, and it determines, more than any other single factor, which men actually shape what gets decided, and which men participate in the administrative process of documenting what has already been determined. In the modern corporate environment, the informal hierarchy operates through a specific and identifiable mechanism that almost every capable professional has experienced without knowing how to name what they were experiencing. Consequential decisions are not made in the formal processes designed to make them. They are pre-processed, before the committee meets, before the formal review is convened, before any official deliberation is scheduled. Certain names have been discussed in bilateral conversations between people who trust each other enough to speak without performance. The actual assumptions behind a strategic initiative have been stress-tested in exchanges that will never appear in any meeting record. The real scope of a problem has been examined in a conversation between two people who can be direct with each other in a way the formal setting will never permit. By the time the official process begins, the outcome has typically been reached. The formal process is the administrative procedure of documenting it. This is not corruption. It is the necessary consequence of how human decision-making actually works at any level of genuine complexity. Official processes cannot hold the kind of conversation where people speak without managing appearances, challenge without political consequence, and think without the constraint of being observed thinking. The informal pre-processing exists because the formal process requires it to function at all. The conversation before the meeting is not the shadow of the real deliberation. It is the real deliberation. The man who does not understand this architecture arrives at formal processes prepared to perform his case. He has his data, his position, his contributions staged for maximum visibility in the official setting. He participates with genuine capability and real preparation in a process whose outcome was largely determined before he walked in, not through any deliberate exclusion aimed at him specifically. Through the completely natural operation of an informal system in which he has not built the relational access that would have placed him in the prior conversations. The performance of his formal participation is real, and it is noticed. It simply isn't the variable being evaluated by the people who matter most in that room. They have already done their evaluating. The meeting is something else. There is one dimension of how informal access is actually built that the formal system is constitutionally unable to teach, and it is the one most men get wrong even after they have understood everything else. It is not networking in the conventional sense. It is not political maneuvering or strategic relationship cultivation in the way those terms are usually deployed. It is something more specific and more demanding. It is the discipline of not formalizing too soon. The man who has accumulated genuine informal authority, who has become the person others consult before decisions are announced, whose framing of a problem shapes how the problem is understood before anyone has officially begun to solve it, holds something that official recognition cannot produce and formal appointment cannot replicate. That something exists precisely because it is not yet official. It is not subject to review, not contestable through procedure, not vulnerable to the institutional recalibration that every formal position eventually faces. It operates in the space the official system cannot govern, and in that space it compounds freely, without friction. Every time that authority is converted into a formal claim, a promotion sought, a title requested, an official designation pursued, it crosses a threshold from which there is no return. What was informal becomes visible. What was uncontestable becomes reviewable. What had been moving freely in the space between official acknowledgement and actual organizational dependence is now inside the system, subject to every constraint that system applies to everything it officially contains. The man who understands this does not refuse formal recognition. He times it with a precision most men never develop, because developing it requires seeing the informal hierarchy clearly enough to know the difference between the moment when formal recognition confirms something already established and the moment when it is being sought to establish something that isn't yet real. Those two moments produce entirely different negotiations. In the first, the organization is catching up to a reality it has been depending on for some time. In the second, the organization is being asked to extend credit against a position that hasn't fully been built yet. The difference in outcome between those two conversations is not small. The digital professional environment has created something that has no historical precedent, a partially visible map of the informal hierarchy, updated in real time, accessible to anyone with the social intelligence to read it. Public intellectual discourse, professional network engagement patterns, the granular evidence of who amplifies whose thinking and who simply receives amplification. All of this constitutes a continuously updated signal of where informal authority actually sits across industries and professional communities. Most men are navigating this environment with instincts formed before it existed, which means they are importing assumptions from a world where these signals were invisible into a world where they are legible to anyone paying close enough attention. Two distinct hierarchies have formed in digital professional space. They are frequently confused for each other, and the confusion is consequential. The first is the visibility hierarchy. Audience size, engagement metrics, algorithmic distribution, the reach that content volume and platform calibration produce. This hierarchy is real. It governs how many people encounter your thinking. A large position in the visibility hierarchy is not nothing, but it is not authority.
And in digital professional environments, the two have become almost entirely decoupled. Not accidentally, but because the behaviors that build each of them are in direct tension. The visibility hierarchy rewards volume, cadence, and the specific calibration to what platforms distribute, consistency, broad accessibility, the kind of content that performs across the widest possible audience because it has been optimized, consciously or not, to do exactly that. The man who builds a large position in this hierarchy has learned to produce at the rate the platform rewards. What he has not built is the informal authority that causes his name to appear in private conversations he will never witness. The bilateral exchange before a decision is made, the shortlist assembled when a room needs a specific kind of judgment, the referral offered by someone who knows his thinking well enough to stake their own credibility on it. The informal authority hierarchy in digital space is built on an entirely different mechanism. It is built on the inference of a selection process that the observer cannot see. When a man engages selectively,
when the observer cannot fully account for what he chooses to address and what he allows to pass, when the pattern of his contributions implies a rigorous interior process that is never made fully visible. The observer's mind does what minds do with incomplete information. It fills the gap, not with nothing, with something more substantial than any explanation would have produced. The picture is compelling but not closed, and an unclosed picture is assigned more depth than a complete one. Reach compounds with the platform's algorithm. Informal authority compounds with the quality of the minds paying attention, the specific people in any domain who are actually making decisions, shaping directions, and conducting the bilateral conversations before announcements go out. Those two compounding curves run in entirely different directions. One produces a large, wide shadow. The other produces weight. There is a final structural truth about informal hierarchies that Machiavelli perceived with complete clarity, and that almost nothing written about power in the modern era states with sufficient precision. The informal hierarchy is self-renewing. Not through conspiracy or deliberate gatekeeping, but through the mechanism by which any system that functions tends to perpetuate the conditions of its functioning.
The men who hold positions in the informal hierarchy arrived there by navigating the actual system, by building trust and proximity across levels, by developing the specific social intelligence of knowing which conversations to have before which decisions are made, by accumulating the kind of credibility that cannot be assigned by any official process because it depends on the direct experience of people who have engaged with them without the mediation of institutional context. They understand, even if they have never articulated it as a framework, why the system works the way it works. And they are, as a consequence, specifically attentive to men who demonstrate the same understanding, not as a selection criterion they consciously apply, but as the natural expression of a hierarchy of judgment, which is, at its deepest level,
what the informal hierarchy actually is. It is not a hierarchy of credentials. It is not a hierarchy of formal performance or officially recognized capability. It is a hierarchy of perception, of whether a man's relationship to the social environment around him reflects an accurate model of how that environment actually operates, or a flattering one. The men inside the informal hierarchy are, in the aggregate, reasonably good at detecting the difference between a man who sees the system with accuracy and a man who has recently learned sophisticated language for describing it. This is where the framework becomes genuinely uncomfortable in a way that most frameworks on this subject are careful to avoid. The man who encounters this material and immediately begins to calibrate his behavior, who starts thinking about positional patience, who maps the informal hierarchy of his organization, who adjusts his response patterns and manages his formal claims more carefully, has understood the content. The content is real. The calibration will produce some results. But the informal hierarchy he is attempting to enter is not assembled from men who learn to behave this way. It is assembled from men for whom this way of seeing arrived before any framework described it. Men for whom the behavioral signals this video has named are not tactics they apply, but the natural expression of a perception they already hold. The map can be learned. The perception can be developed. The gap between a man who is applying a framework and a man who is living a way of seeing does close, over time, through the accumulated experience of navigating the actual system with genuine attention rather than tactical overlay. But it does not close quickly, and it does not close through the application of techniques. It closes through the slower, less legible process of actually revising what you see when you walk into a room, until the revision is complete enough that you stop revising and start simply seeing. The informal hierarchy can tell where a man is in that process, not through any formal assessment, through the texture of every interaction, the small moments that carry no official weight, but that communicate with total clarity to the men trained to read them. Whether the person they are engaging with perceives the actual geometry of the room or only its official version. And that leaves a question this video cannot resolve. Whether knowing the map exists, knowing what it contains, knowing how the territory is shaped, knowing the difference between the system you were shown and the system that actually operates, whether that knowledge accelerates the development of the perception that makes the map unnecessary, or whether it is simply the most sophisticated version of the same confusion you started with. A man who now understands, in considerable detail, the nature of the room he has not yet learned to read.